The file opens with a sentence that arrives far too late. Accounted for. Second Lieutenant Robert T. McCollum had been 22 when his name first slipped into military paperwork as missing, after a June morning over the Baltic that never fully explained itself. He survived the sky long enough to fall into water no one could reach. For decades, his wife Ethel held on to that distinction, neither widow nor bride, folding and refolding the same telegram until the paper softened at the creases. Maybe he landed somewhere, someone once told her. It was meant kindly. I only know that behind it were other names. Men who came back carrying what Robert did not. The sea kept the rest. On the morning of June 20th, 1944, RAF Hethel woke before the sun. The concrete runways still held the night's cold, and the grass along the dispersal points was damp enough to darken the cuffs of trousers. Ground crews moved without conversation, hands already blackened by oil, boots crunching gravel in a rhythm learned through repetition rather than choice. Engines would start soon. Orders had already been posted. Second Lieutenant Robert T. McCollum buttoned his flight jacket inside a drafty hut that smelled of damp wool and burnt coffee. The jacket was heavier than it looked, lined against altitude cold, its zipper stiff from use. He tugged it twice before it settled. He always did that. The habit annoyed him. But breaking it felt worse. "Pilots," someone said behind him, reading the chalkboard out loud. McCollum didn't turn. "I know." He had seen the name an hour earlier during briefing, written neatly beside a red grease pencil arrow pointing east. Pilots meant distance. Pilots meant water. It meant long minutes of straight flight, with nowhere to turn and nothing to do but hold steady. Before leaving the hut, he checked his pockets in the same order he always did. Gloves, goggles, escape kit, dog tags. The tags touched each other softly, metal on metal. He paused at the sound, then tucked them back beneath his shirt, close to his chest, where Ethel's last letter rested, folded thin enough to forget it was there. The walk to the aircraft took longer than usual. Fog clung low to the field, thinning and thickening in patches, blurring the outlines of parked Liberators until they looked unfinished, like sketches waiting for ink. The B-24, assigned to his crew tail number 421-00351, sat with its nose angled slightly off the taxiway, plexiglass catching what little light there was. Lieutenant William Powers, Jr., the pilot, stood near the nose wheel with a clipboard, cap pulled low. He looked up as McCollum approached. "You ready to earn your pay, Bob?" Powers said, trying to keep it light. McCollum smiled the way he always did before missions tight. Brief. "Just point me straight." Oscar Boudreau, the co-pilot, was already climbing the ladder, muttering something about Louisiana weather being kinder than this. Someone laughed. Someone always laughed. It was part of the routine. Jokes before engines, quiet afterward. McCollum paused at the nose, resting one gloved hand against the cold aluminum skin. Condensation slicked the surface. He pressed harder than necessary, as if checking that it was real. From here, he could see the Norden bomb sight already mounted inside. Glass polished, mechanisms checked and rechecked earlier that morning. It looked fragile, despite its importance. A delicate thing trusted to guide tons of explosives. He climbed in last. Inside the nose compartment, space narrowed quickly. The curved plexiglass distorted the outside world, bending men into warped shapes and lights into halos. McCollum settled into his seat, adjusted his straps, and ran his fingers once over the bombsight housing. It was cool and solid, familiar. He thought of Cleveland, of Lakewood streets, still dark at this hour. Of Ethel waking alone in an apartment that felt too quiet since he'd left. She had written about a neighbor's dog barking at nothing, about ration coupons, about how she kept the radio on even when she wasn't listening. There had been a plan once, after the war, maybe California, someplace warmer. He hadn't written that part down. It felt like tempting something. Inner phone check crackled through his headset. "Bombardier," loud and clear, McCollum replied. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Engines started in sequence, each Pratt and Whitney coughing, then settling into a deep vibration that pressed against his chest. The smell of fuel seeped in, sharp and familiar. As the aircraft taxied, the vibration changed subtly, a language he had learned to read with his body. Takeoff came quickly. The runway rushed beneath them, fog peeling away as speed built. Then the sudden lightness, the unmistakable shift as the ground dropped away. McCollum felt it in his stomach every time. The same small jolt of fear followed by relief. They were airborne. They had survived the first part. Climb out took them into thinning cloud. Other liberators appeared and disappeared around them. Dark shapes holding formation with unnerving closeness. Wings overlapped. Propellers flashed. Somewhere off the left, a plane corrected too sharply, then steadied. No one commented. At altitude, the temperature dropped fast. Frost traced thin lines along the inside of the plexiglass, feathering outward. McCollum flexed his fingers inside his gloves, then leaned forward to peer through the bombsight. Below them, the North Sea stretched flat and gray, broken only by faint whitecaps. He marked headings, cross-checked timing, adjusted small knobs with deliberate care. Minutes stretched. Routine took over. Scan instruments, confirm course, listen. He thought of his parents, Ernest and Caroline, who would already be awake back home, his mother likely at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug. He had promised to write again after this mission. He always promised. 10 minutes to coast, Powers announced. As they crossed Denmark, flak appeared first distant bursts, then closer, black blossoms blooming at their altitude. The aircraft shuddered as pressure waves slapped against it. McCollum felt the concussions through the floor, through the seat, through his teeth. Somewhere aft, a gunner swore. Steady, Powers said. It was an order and a plea. Approaching the Baltic, the formation tightened. The air grew rougher, turbulence rolling them unpredictably. McCollum braced his boots against the footrest. Hands steady on the bomb sight as the aircraft yawed, then corrected. Outside, flak thickened. Bursts walked toward them, adjusted by unseen hands below. He heard a sharp metallic crack, then another. The plane lurched sideways, hard enough to slam him against his straps. Collision, someone yelled over the interphone. McCollum barely had time to look up. Another B-24 filled the right side of the nose, impossibly close, its wings slicing across his view. There was a grinding sound, metal against metal, followed by a violent shudder that tore through the aircraft. The world tilted. Objects lifted from where they belonged. The bombsight jerked against its mount. McCollum felt weightless for a fraction of a second, then slammed forward as the plane pitched. The interphone erupted with overlapping voices. I can't. Get out. Controls. Cold air rushed in from somewhere behind him. The nose compartment filled with noise and pressure. A roar that erased thought. McCollum reached instinctively for the ladder behind him, fingers scraping metal. The aircraft spun, centrifugal force pressing him sideways, pinning him against the curved glass. He thought, absurdly, of Ethel's handwriting, of how careful she was with the loops of her letters. There was no time to speak. Outside, the Baltic waited dark, cold, indifferent. The Liberator struck the water at speed, and the impact tore the remaining structure apart. For Powers and Boudreaux, the break came just early enough. For the others, McCollum, Donis, Baker, Vansel, Gordon, Holly, it did not. I can't pretend I know what it felt like in those final seconds inside the nose of that aircraft. I only know that decisions made in routine, where to sit, how to strap in, which pocket held, which object suddenly mattered in ways no training could change. By the time the sea closed over the wreckage, 8 lives were already gone. And for the families waiting across an ocean, the day ended without explanation, only the beginning of a waiting that would last decades. The war did not stop on June 20th. It moved forward without them. At RAF Hethel, the empty hardstand where B-24 tail number 42100-351 had been parked was already assigned to another aircraft by the following morning. Ground crews scraped oil from the concrete, gathered loose fragments of plexiglass blown in by prop wash, and stacked unused ammunition crates back into storage. There was no ceremony. There rarely was. In the operations office, a clerk typed names into a form already familiar to his fingers. Missing in action. 8 entries. The ribbon on the typewriter was running thin, letters striking paper a shade lighter than usual. Second Lieutenant Robert T. McCollum's name went in the 4th line. The report that followed, formal, precise, described a mid-air collision over the Baltic Sea, location approximate, cause attributed to combat conditions. It noted that 2 crew members had parachuted and been taken prisoner. The others were listed as unaccounted for. There were no descriptions of the nose compartment, no mention of the bomb site, no space for the letter folded in a breast pocket. When William Powers and Oscar Boudreaux arrived at Stalag 7, Weeks later, thin and bruised, German guards took their watches, their belts, and their sense of time. They were questioned separately, then together. Dates blurred. Names were repeated until they sounded strange. They spun away, Powers said during one interrogation, his voice hoarse. The other ship lost its tail. Ours went straight down. Anyone else jump? The interrogator asked. No, Powers answered. He did not elaborate. He could not. Back in Ohio, the telegram reached Lakewood on a hot afternoon. Ethel McCollum was standing at the kitchen sink when the knock came. The linoleum was cool under her bare feet. She wiped her hands on a towel before opening the door, already knowing something was wrong by the look on the boy's face. We regret to inform you. She read the rest later, sitting at the table with the telegram smoothed flat beneath her palms. The words were careful. Missing. Not dead. Not alive. A condition that offered no instructions. Her mother-in-law, Caroline, arrived that evening with a casserole she forgot to put in the oven. They sat across from each other, the radio humming softly in the corner. Every few minutes, Caroline reached for the telegram, then stopped herself. He's strong, she said finally. You're Robert. He always was. Ethel nodded, though she felt something tighten in her chest. That night, she folded the telegram and placed it in the same drawer as his earlier letters, aligning the edges until they matched. She would open that drawer every morning afterward, sometimes just to confirm it was still there. For Robert's parents, the waiting took on a shape of its own. Ernest McCollum kept going to work, kept mowing the lawn on Saturdays, kept the garage swept as if his son might come home and notice. Caroline wrote to the War Department twice that summer, asking if there was any additional information. The replies were polite and empty. We will notify you immediately should new details become available, one letter read. In the months that followed, rumors traveled faster than facts. A neighbor mentioned hearing about a flyer who'd washed ashore in Denmark. A distant cousin claimed to have read something similar in a newspaper. Each fragment was examined, weighed, and then set aside when it led nowhere. Ethel began a routine she did not plan. She listened to the radio at noon and again in the evening, scanning casualty lists read aloud in measured voices. She clipped nothing. She wrote nothing down. When Robert's name did not appear, she felt relief and guilt in equal measure. There's a kind of waiting that changes a person. I can say now, but for Ethel it was simpler. She stopped buying green apples because Robert liked them. She stopped setting 2 cups on the counter in the morning. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Church bells rang in Cleveland. People gathered on porches and sidewalks, laughing and crying at once. Ethel stood among them, clapping when others did, smiling when expected. Later that night, she returned to the apartment and sat on the edge of the bed, holding one of Robert's shirts. It still smelled faintly of soap and something else she could not name. When POW lists were released, names printed in dense columns, Ethel searched them carefully. William Powers, Oscar Boudreau. She traced the lines with her finger, heart pounding, hoping against reason for Robert's name to appear among the living. It did not. In June of 1945, exactly 1 year after the mission, another letter arrived, thicker than the telegram, heavier with implication. The War Department had issued a finding of death. The language was clinical, the decision administrative. It did not say how Robert had died, only that enough time had passed to presume he had. Caroline read the letter aloud at the dining room table, her voice steady until the last sentence. So that's it, Ernest said quietly when she finished. Ethel did not cry then. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer, and closed it with both hands. The drawer made a soft wooden sound as it slid shut, final and unremarkable. For the military, the case moved into another category. Investigators from the American Graves Registration Command reviewed coastal reports from Denmark. They interviewed fishermen. They examined unidentified remains recovered from beaches in the years following the crash. Distances were measured. Tides were calculated. The Baltic did not give anything back. By 1950, the file received a final notation. Non-recoverable. It meant the same thing in bureaucratic terms that Ethel already knew in her body that no one was coming home. Robert T. McCollum's name was carved into stone at the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, among thousands of others lost over water. The letters were clean, evenly spaced. A place existed now where someone could stand and say his name out loud. Ethel never went. She did not need a wall to remember him. Instead, she kept small things. His watch stopped at an hour that no longer mattered. A photograph taken before training. His cap tilted slightly, his smile uncertain. Every year, on October 20th, she wrote his name on a piece of paper and tucked it into the drawer, adding nothing else. "I don't want him to disappear twice," she once said to a friend, explaining the habit. "I can't pretend I know what it meant to live forward while holding on backward at the same time. But I know this. History did not record Robert's silence as absence. It recorded it as paperwork completed, as names engraved, as files closed. For the people who loved him, nothing felt finished. The war had taken his future, and time took the rest slowly, quietly leaving behind routines that never quite fit the way they used to. And beneath the Baltic, the wreckage settled deeper into the seabed, carrying with it answers no one yet knew how to reach. The first sign was not a bone. It was a weight. In the summer of 2019, a Danish diver surfaced near the island of Langland, holding something that did not belong to the sea. It was heavy, uneven, dark with corrosion, and unmistakably mechanical. When he passed it onto the deck of the boat, seawater pooled beneath it, carrying the sharp, old smell of iron. Someone rinsed it gently with a hose, and a familiar shape emerged. The barrel and receiver of a .50 caliber machine gun. World War II, one of the divers said, more statement than question. They had been mapping the seabed for unrelated work, moving slowly over an area known to fishermen for snag nets and odd sonar returns. The Baltic here was shallow enough for light to reach, but the bottom shifted constantly. Layers of silt sliding over one another with each season. What lay beneath could stay hidden for decades, then appear briefly before sinking again. The gun did not come up alone. Sonar images taken afterward showed more angular shadows, long straight lines that did not match rock or reef. The pattern was wrong, too deliberate, too broken. The Danish Navy was notified. So was the National Museum. Within weeks, the coordinates were shared quietly with an agency across the Atlantic that still kept track of names like Robert T. McCollum. At the Defense POW, MIA accounting agency, the report landed on a desk already crowded with files. Baltic Sea, aircraft wreckage, possible American origin. The location sat within a rough circle drawn decades earlier by missing aircrew reports close enough to matter. A DPAA analyst pulled an old microfilm reel and fed it into a reader. The image flickered, then steadied. MACR number 5933. Mid-air collision. June 20th, 1944. Baltic Sea near Langland. He read the crew list slowly, lips moving without sound. McCollum, Himes, Danis, Baker, Vansel, Gordon, Holly. The modern investigation did not begin with certainty. It began with restraint. Before anyone could touch the site, it had to be made safe. World War II aircraft often carried what they had never released: bombs, ammunition, live ordnance resting in darkness. In August of 2021, an explosive ordnance disposal team from the Royal Danish Navy descended into the same water where the Liberator had vanished. Visibility was poor. Silt rose with every movement, turning the world into a brown haze. Divers moved by memory and touch, hands brushing against twisted aluminum, fabric long since stripped away. They found ammunition belts fused together by rust, bomb casings half buried, shapes that demanded caution. Clear on this section. One diver reported through a muffled microphone, his breath loud in his ears. When the site was declared safe, archaeologists followed. Project Recover brought a different posture underwater. They did not search quickly. They mapped. They photographed. They marked positions with small weighted flags that fluttered gently in the current. Each fragment was treated not as debris, but as context. A section of fuselage lay on its side, torn open. Nearby, the remains of a waste gun mount. Farther out, a scatter of personal items small, almost missed things. A boot sole, a piece of fabric with a zipper corroded half shut. One diver paused over a curved section of plexiglass, its edges crazed but intact enough to catch light. He knew what that shape meant. The nose, he said quietly when he surfaced later. Back in the United States, DPAA officials began contacting families carefully, cautiously. For some, it was the first time the phone had rung with news in generations. For others, the call went to grandchildren, who had grown up with a name but no story. "We may have located the aircraft," one official explained. "We can't promise anything yet." In Ohio, Robert McCollum's relatives gathered around a kitchen table not unlike the one Ethel had once sat at. Someone brought out an old envelope of photographs. Someone else placed a hand flat on the wood, steadying themselves. In 1944, identification had ended at the shoreline. In 2019, it began underwater. Recovery took years. Sediment was removed by hand and suction, layer by layer. Human remains were encountered gradually, never announced, always documented. Each discovery brought the work to a halt until everything was recorded. A dog tag surfaced in 2022. Its chain broken, the metal dulled but legible. Another followed months later. Names were read only after careful conservation. One read, John H. Danaker. Another, recovered nearby, belonged to Milton Himes. The absence of other tags did not mean other men were not there. The sea had been rearranging the site for 75 years. Bones lay where currents had taken them, not where bodies had fallen. By 2024, enough material had been recovered to begin laboratory work. Boxes arrived at the DPAA facility, marked only with case numbers and coordinates. Inside were fragments that required patience to understand. Anthropologists worked under bright lights, measuring, cataloging, comparing. Dental specialists matched teeth to records preserved since 1942. Geneticists extracted what they could from bone, long submerged, amplifying traces that should not have survived. One analyst stared at a computer screen late into the evening as comparison markers aligned. Mitochondrial sequences matched family reference samples provided years earlier. Autosomal data narrowed it further. He leaned back, exhaled, and said aloud to no one, "That's him." The laboratory was quiet, in a way the Baltic never had been. Inside the DPAA forensic facility, sound came softly, gloves brushing against stainless steel, the low hum of ventilation, the faint scrape of a caliper closing around bone. Here, nothing rushed. Time was measured in millimeters and decimal points, not years. The remains attributed to the crash site near Langland were laid out across multiple tables, separated carefully, each fragment tagged with a code that linked it back to a specific square meter of seabed. There were no assumptions made about who was who. Not yet. Reconstruction began without names. An anthropologist lifted a fragment of femur, turning it slowly under the light. The surface bore the subtle etching of long submersion, smooth in places, pitted in others. She noted muscle attachment points, estimated stature, recorded age ranges that overlapped and diverged. Male, early 20s, she said to the recorder, consistent with aircrew profile. Across the room, a dental specialist compared a recovered molar to a chart dated 1942. The ink on the original record had faded to brown, but the notations were precise fillings, alignment, a small irregularity on the right side. "This one lines up," he said quietly. "Not conclusive alone, but it's promising." The process moved forward by accumulation. No single piece carried enough weight to speak for itself. Together, they began to tell something closer to a story. Ballistics experts examined the recovered .50 caliber machine gun. Its serial number partially obscured by corrosion. Under magnification and careful cleaning, enough characters emerged to narrow its origin. It matched a batch delivered to Ford's Willow Run plant in early 1944. Records showed that batch assigned to B-24 seconds delivered to the 389th Bomb Group. It did not say McCollum, but it said, "this aircraft." Mapping specialists overlaid underwater sonar images with wartime reports. The distribution of wreckage nose components here, tail elements farther away, matched witness descriptions from 1944. The way the aluminum had torn suggested high-speed impact, not controlled descent. A structural engineer traced the pattern with a pen. "Nose first," he said. "No chance to break apart gradually." That mattered. It explained why certain crew positions, pilot, co-pilot, had a narrow window to escape, while others did not. It explained why the Bombardier's compartment showed catastrophic failure. It did not soften the conclusion. It clarified it. DNA analysis took the longest. Bone samples were powdered carefully, dissolved, filtered. What emerged was fragile genetic material that had survived cold, pressure, and time by narrow margins. Mitochondrial DNA was extracted first, compared against reference samples provided by maternal relatives decades after the war. The match probability climbed steadily, then crossed a threshold. Autosomal DNA followed, harder to recover, more precise. When those markers aligned as well, the case shifted. A forensic biologist removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "We have convergence," she said. "Historical, anthropological, dental, genetic. It's him." The words were written into a report that ran dozens of pages. Each conclusion cited, each uncertainty acknowledged. Nothing was overstated. Nothing needed to be. Second Lieutenant Robert T. McCollum was no longer a name carved into stone without a body. He was present again, in fragments that fit together just enough. For the other men, Dennis, Baker, Vansel, Gordon, Holly, the picture remained incomplete. Some remains could not yet be separated with confidence. Some evidence had been scattered too widely, by currents and collapse. The file reflected that truth. Identification was not an ending for everyone at once. Before the final notification, a case officer reviewed McCollum's personal history one more time. Cleveland, marriage to Ethel, Bombardier training, assigned to the 565th Squadron. He paused over a line item. Position in aircraft. Nose compartment. The officer closed the folder gently. "I wish we could tell them more," he said to no one in particular. The family briefing took place over a secure call. Faces filled the screen, some young, some lined with age that had accumulated in the years of not knowing. "We are confident," the DPAA representative said, choosing each word carefully. "Your uncle, your grandfather, has been identified." There was a pause. Then someone said, "Thank you," as if it were the only phrase available. "I can't pretend I understand what it feels like to see science answer a question that grief has been holding for a lifetime. But I watched the way hands covered mouths, the way eyes closed not in disbelief but in release." Forensic reconstruction did not bring Robert back to life. It did not give him new words or choices. What it did was restore specificity. He was not just lost in water. He was here, and then gone. The final act of the laboratory was small. A technician placed the identified remains into a transfer case, lining it with white fabric, adjusting each piece so nothing rested unnaturally. A flag would come later. For now, there was only the careful closing of a lid, the click of a latch, and a label bearing a name that had waited 80 years to be written with certainty. The official notification came on December 10, 2024. Second Lieutenant Robert T. McCollum was finally identified. For the agency, it was a successful case. For the family, it was something harder to define. "He's coming home," someone said during the call, voice breaking on the word home. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like to receive confirmation after 80 years of not knowing where a life had ended. But I know the call did not erase the waiting. It gave it shape. Arrangements followed. Paperwork moved. A flag was folded in advance. In Cambridge, a small rosette would be placed beside Robert's name, marking that he was no longer counted among the missing. Beneath the Baltic, the site remained. Not empty, not complete, just quieter now. Its purpose changed. What had begun with a piece of corroded steel ended with a name spoken clearly again. But discovery, like loss, rarely arrives all at once. It comes in pieces, lifted slowly from dark water, asking to be handled with care. The phone call did not come with instructions for how to feel. When the DPAA notification ended, the screen went dark, and the room stayed quiet longer than anyone expected. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else reached for a glass of water and missed it the first time. The name Robert T. McCollum hung in the air, heavier now that it no longer drifted. He was real, a granddaughter said finally, surprising herself with the words. She had grown up with the story of a man who disappeared before stories could settle into memory. Photographs had been few. Details had always ended too early. Now, there were answers, but they did not arrive neatly. They arrived layered over a lifetime of habits built around not having them. For Ethel McCollum, there was no phone call. She had died years earlier, carrying Robert's name with her, without ever hearing it spoken again by an official voice. But her routines remained, preserved in objects passed down, the drawer where letters had been kept, the watch wrapped in tissue paper, the careful way documents had been folded and refolded. She never remarried, one family member said, almost apologetically, as if explaining a choice that still needed justification. She said she already had a husband. One family member is about I and tend you. I can't pretend I know what it costs to live that way, holding a place open for someone who never walks back into it. But I know it changes how time moves inside a person. Days still pass. Years still stack. Something else stays fixed. The decision about where to bury Robert was not simple. Ohio was where he came from. England was where his name had been carved. California was where his closest living relatives now lived. In the end, proximity won not out of convenience, but care. We want somewhere we can visit, they said. On paper, the burial was scheduled for May 3rd, 2025. In practice, the preparation began immediately. A uniform was selected, dress blues, carefully pressed. Insignia aligned exactly as regulations dictated. Medals were ordered, each one representing a category of service that Robert himself had never held in his hands. The flag was measured, folded, unfolded, and folded again until the creases were sharp enough to guide fingers without looking. A casualty assistance officer reviewed the timeline with the family, filling in gaps that history had left vague. He likely never knew what hit them, the officer said gently. That's consistent with the evidence. Someone nodded. Someone else looked away. In Cleveland, a cousin walked past the house where Robert had grown up. It looked smaller than memory suggested. The porch steps had been replaced. The tree out front was gone. He used to sit right there, the cousin said, pointing. Always said he liked watching people pass. The human truth of the case did not live in the lab or the archive. It lived in these small returns places revisited with new knowledge, objects re-examined with changed meaning. At Oak Hill Memorial Park in San Jose, preparations were quiet and methodical. A plot was selected beneath a tree that would offer shade in the afternoon. The groundskeeper marked the spot with a temporary stake, pressed into soil that smelled faintly of cut grass and water. He'll face east, the groundskeeper said. That's what most families want. No one corrected him. East had already taken enough. The day of burial arrived clear and warm. Chairs were arranged in careful rows. A small table held the flag, folded tight. The casket arrived draped in white, then covered with the flag, the fabric heavy and exact. A uniformed honor guard stood at attention. Their movements were precise, practiced, respectful. For them, this was part of duty. For the family, it was something closer to repair. A chaplain spoke briefly, choosing words that did not overreach. Second Lieutenant Robert T. McCollum served his country with courage, he said. Today, we honor that service and welcome him home. Is Pravidin. A family member stepped forward to place a photograph on the casket. Robert in uniform, smiling uncertainly, cap tilted just slightly. The image had been enlarged from an original, no bigger than a postcard. He looks young, someone whispered. He was, another replied. When the rifle volley sounded, it cut cleanly through the afternoon air. 3 sharp cracks. The echo faded quickly, leaving a silence filled only by wind in the trees and the distant sound of traffic beyond the cemetery gates. As the flag was folded, each motion had meaning, even if not everyone present knew the specifics. When it was handed to the next of kin, the officer knelt, his knee pressing into the grass. On behalf of the President of the United States, he began, then stopped briefly to steady his voice, and a grateful nation. The flag changed hands. It felt heavier than it looked. I can't pretend I know what it means to receive something meant for someone else, 80 years late, and still accept it as yours. But I watched the way fingers traced the edges of the fabric, careful not to disturb the folds. After the ceremony, people lingered. Some spoke. Some stood quietly, hands in pockets, eyes on the ground. A child asked why the man in the picture didn't get to come home before. Because sometimes wars don't let people finish things, an adult answered. At Cambridge American Cemetery, thousands of miles away, a small rosette was placed beside Robert's name on the wall of the missing. It was a modest gesture, bronze against stone, but it changed the meaning of the inscription. He was no longer counted among those without a known resting place. For the family, this mattered more than expected. It's like closing a door gently instead of having it slam, one said. The human truth of Robert T. McCollum's story is not found in the collision, or even in the recovery. It is found in what followed his absence. A marriage that stayed intact in memory. Parents who kept routines alive for someone who never returned. Generations who inherited a question and finally received an answer. After the burial, someone placed a small stone on the grave, an old habit borrowed from elsewhere. It sat there, unremarkable, doing nothing except marking that someone had stood in that spot and cared enough to leave something behind. That night, at home, a family member opened a drawer and removed a stack of old papers. Letters were unfolded carefully, their creases deep from years of repetition. One envelope contained a pressed flower, brittle but intact. "She saved everything," the family member said softly. The war had taken Robert's future. Time had taken most of the witnesses. What remained were these gestures, keeping, returning, naming. Human truth is not loud. It does not announce itself with certainty. It settles into the places people live, into the ways they learn to hold loss, without letting it hollow them out completely. Robert T. McCollum did not come back as the man he might have been. He came back as himself, finally accounted for, his story no longer suspended between lines of text. For the people who waited, that was enough. After May 3rd, 2025, the cemetery went back to being a cemetery. The chairs were folded and stored. The honor guard drove away. The grass that had been pressed flat by polished shoes rose again in the afternoon heat. A groundskeeper returned with a hose, watering nearby plots in a slow arc that left the air smelling of damp earth and cut lawn. Life did what it always does. It continued in small maintenance. Robert T. McCollum's grave stayed. At first, the family visited the way people do right after a funeral too often, as if frequency could keep the moment from sliding into the past. They brought flowers. They brought a folded program from the ceremony, laminated so it wouldn't tear. One relative, older than the others, brought a small hand broom and brushed away fallen leaves, even when there were hardly any. "Just looks better," he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. On the third visit, someone arrived with a cardboard box. Inside were the objects that had lived a quiet life in closets and drawers for decades. Robert's photographs, his service papers, Ethel's telegram, and the watch that had stopped long ago. The box smelled faintly of attic dust, a dry, papery scent that clung to the fingertips after touching old things. They sat on a bench nearby and began taking items out one by one. A niece held the watch in her palm. The leather strap had cracked where it bent around a wrist that no longer existed. The glass was scratched, the hands frozen. She turned it over, reading the tiny engraving on the back that no one had noticed before. A short line of text, half worn away, but still legible enough to make out a name and a date. "Did he buy this before he left?" she asked. No one knew for sure. But the question mattered because it was the kind of choice Robert had made when he still had choices what to spend money on, what to carry, what to keep close. A nephew unfolded Ethel's telegram. The paper was thinner than he expected, almost translucent at the folds. It had been handled so many times the creases had softened, turning sharp corners into gentle curves. The ink had faded, but the words remained. Missing in action, he read aloud, then stopped. He didn't finish the rest. Everyone already knew the language. The difference now was that the telegram no longer described a present condition. It had become a record of the moment the family's life tilted. They talked about Ethel more than they talked about Robert. It happened naturally. She was the one whose days had been stretched around the gap. One relative remembered visiting her as a child and noticing that she kept a chair near the window empty, even when guests came over. "She said it was for air," the relative recalled. "But I think it was for him." Another person remembered a habit that sounded small until you heard it in full. Ethel had continued addressing Christmas cards as Mr. and Mrs. Robert T. McCollum for years, even after the finding of death. The post office never corrected it. The neighbors never commented. It was simply how she kept the world arranged. This wasn't a statistic, I can say, and mean it in the most grounded way. This was a woman choosing ink and paper as a form of loyalty, year after year, in the face of an outcome she couldn't change. The family also talked about William Powers and Oscar Boudreau, the two men who had lived. Their survival had always been part of the file, but now it felt personal, like a thread you could follow into another life. Powers had come home thin and older than his photograph suggested. He had married, worked, built a routine, but he rarely spoke about the crash. When he did, it was in short, clipped sentences that sounded like he had rehearsed them to keep emotion out. It happened fast, he once told someone at a reunion. That's all I'll say. Mine damns. Mine damns. Boudreaux, the Louisiana co-pilot, had returned too. He had lived long enough to become an old man with grandchildren. The family found a line from an interview he'd given years later, buried in an archive. He remembered the cold air rushing in, the way the plane yawed, and the moment Powers shouted for him to jump. Go, Oscar, go now, Powers had yelled. That line, simple, urgent, was the closest thing anyone had to a final conversation between men who were about to be separated permanently. It was not poetic. It was not meant to be remembered, and yet it had survived. A new human detail surfaced in the months after the burial, passed along by a distant cousin who had kept an envelope of documents no one else had seen. Inside was a copy of Robert's Bombardier training notes, handwritten calculations, headings, small corrections in the margins. On the back page, in pencil, was a short list titled After. It wasn't a grand plan. It was plain and almost boyish. Asterisk. Buy a car, not used. Asterisk. Take Ethel to the ocean. Asterisk. Sleep in late once. Asterisk. Steak dinner. No ration stamps. The list stopped there, unfinished. But it was enough to make him feel close in a way official records never could. It wasn't about strategy or war. It was about a young man picturing ordinary comfort and writing it down because he needed to believe it existed. At the grave, the niece traced Robert's name on the headstone with one finger, then pulled her hand back as if the stone might be warm. The engraving was crisp. The dates were undeniable. He'd be over 100 now, she said, not as a reflection, just as a fact that landed strangely. Another relative nodded. But he's 22 here, he said, tapping the photograph they had brought again. That's how we got him back. Later, they drove to a diner, not far from the cemetery, the kind with laminated menus and strong coffee. They slid into a booth. The vinyl seat stuck slightly to the back of someone's shirt. They ordered without much appetite, then ate anyway because eating was what you did after difficult days. Between bites, they told stories, some true, some guessed, some pieced together from letters and imagination. Robert liked green apples. Robert wrote neatly. Robert had once fixed a neighbor's radio without being asked. Each detail was small enough to be believable, and each one carried the same purpose, to keep him from being only a uniform and a date. When they left the diner, the late afternoon sun was low and bright, turning windshields into mirrors. The family drove back to Oak Hill one last time before heading home. The cemetery was nearly empty now. They walked to the grave in a loose group. No one spoke at first. The air smelled of warm grass. A breeze moved through the trees, lifting a few leaves and letting them fall again. The older relative, the one with the hand broom, knelt and brushed away a thin line of dust that had settled along the base of the headstone. He did it slowly, carefully, like a repair. Then he stood, cleared his throat, and said the simplest thing anyone could say in that moment. "Okay, Bob," he murmured, "you're here." They left a small stone again, placed near the flowers, and stepped back. For a few seconds, the scene held. A name in stone, a flag folded in a home nearby, a list titled, After That, had finally been read aloud. And then they turned and walked away, their footsteps soft on the path, the grave remaining behind them specific, tended, and no longer drifting somewhere under dark water. Long after the paperwork is finished, what remains is not closure. It is alignment. Robert T. McCollum now rests beneath a tree in San Jose, his name cut cleanly into stone, his dates finally anchored to a place someone can return to. The Baltic no longer holds him, but it has not been erased from the story. It is still there, in the cold water that preserved bone, in the currents that scattered evidence, in the long delay between loss and return. At Cambridge, a rosette sits beside his name, bronze against stone, a small signal that says, found. It does not explain the years before it appeared. It does not soften what Ethel lived with, or what his parents carried quietly, or what later generations inherited without asking. It simply marks a change. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to wait 80 years for a sentence to end. But I know this wasn't about solving a case. It was about restoring weight to a life that had been reduced to coordinates and reports. Robert once wrote a short list titled After. It included a car, the ocean, a late morning, a steak without stamps, ordinary things. Not victory, not legacy, just living. Those plans never happened. But something else did. A name was spoken clearly again. A place was chosen. A flag was folded and handed to waiting hands. And a man who disappeared inside a moment of chaos was allowed, finally, to stay where he belongs. Not in records, not in water, but in memory that no longer has to wander.